To a Russian submarine commander, the North Atlantic Ocean is a vast, dark, romantic battlefield where silent predators stalk their prey and a single mistake can alter global power. To the United States Navy, it's essentially a giant, trillion-dollar Ring doorbell camera designed to make sure European sports cars and container ships full of flat-screen televisions make it to the East Coast on time. So, when Moscow decided to test this security system by sending one of its deadliest, multi-billion-dollar Yasen-class attack submarines to sneak up on an American carrier strike group, they genuinely believed they were starring in a gritty, high-stakes Cold War thriller. What they actually got was a front-row seat to their own acoustic humiliation, because trying to sneak a 13,000-ton nuclear submarine past America's underwater sensor net is about as effective as trying to rob a quiet bank while wearing tap shoes and playing a tuba. The US Navy knows you're there. They know exactly where you're going, and they've been tracking your delivery since you left the dock. Now, breaking down exactly how the US Navy casually dismantled Russia's most advanced submarine is going to be a highly controversial topic, and I don't care if YouTube doesn't promote it. I'm going to expose the tactical truth anyway. Deep dives into sensitive military operations like this one almost always end up getting suppressed by the algorithm. The only way we can force the algorithm to share the truth is if you click the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Thank you. At 02:15 hours, the launch of this so-called silent hunter began. Under the cover of an Arctic night, the massive steel Leviathan slipped away from its naval base, sinking beneath the freezing waves. They relied on special rubber hull coatings to swallow enemy sonar, advanced propulsors to eliminate noise, and a crew trained to breathe quietly. Inside the dimly lit control room, dozens of sailors watched their instruments glow, feeling like the apex predators of the deep. Their orders were to head west, locate the American naval activity, and gather intelligence. But the ocean is a very small place when you're sharing it with the United States military, and observation missions have a funny habit of turning into survival horror movies. By 0440 hours, the submarine had entered a dangerous game of underwater cat and mouse. They were navigating through one of the most heavily monitored, heavily militarized bodies of water on Earth. This wasn't some empty stretch of the Pacific. This was NATO's front yard. The waters were constantly swept by American destroyers, reconnaissance aircraft, and nuclear-powered attack submarines. Yet, the Russian commanders, fueled by an optimism that borders on the medically insane, believed their stealth would hold up. Hour after hour, they crept along underwater ridges and deep oceanic trenches. The Russian sonar operators pressed their headsets to their ears, listening to the maritime symphony around them. Every object in the ocean has a specific acoustic signature, and soon, the Russian operators heard the holy grail of acoustic intelligence. At 07:10 hours, the discovery was made. The Russian sonar screens didn't just light up, they basically caught fire with multiple massive contacts. The acoustic signature was deafeningly obvious. They hadn't just found an American ship, they had stumbled into a full-blown carrier strike group. A US carrier strike group isn't just a formation of ships, it's a floating American zip code with a severe attitude problem. At the center sits a 100,000-ton nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, surrounded by a bodyguard detail of cruisers and destroyers bristling with enough Tomahawk missiles to permanently alter the geography of a medium-sized nation. For the Russians, getting close to this group was a massive intelligence jackpot. It was also the underwater equivalent of walking into a police station with a ski mask on. The deeper they moved into the carrier's perimeter, the closer they got to a defensive net designed specifically to put submarines on the bottom of the ocean permanently. By 1005 hours, the Russian submarine was moving closer, tiptoeing through the maritime minefield. Every single control surface movement, every ballast adjustment had to be flawless. Inside the control room, the air was thick with tension and the smell of stale sweat. The sonar operators were hyper-focused, filtering out the background noise of distant cargo ships to isolate the mechanical roar of the American fleet ahead. They had successfully slipped past the outer screen. They thought they were the ultimate infiltrators, the invisible hand of the Russian Navy. At 12:30 hours, the reality of the American defense network began to quietly close around them. What the Russian crew failed to understand was that the US Navy does not rely on a single line of defense. They operate a multi-layered, omnipotent surveillance grid. Above the clouds, P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft flew geometric orbits while surface destroyers dragged highly sensitive towed array sonars. Modern submarine warfare is often romantically described as a silent duel between invisible hunters where the first one to make a sound dies. The Russians believed they had the advantage of surprise, but in a fight with the US Navy, surprise is just a courtesy the Americans extend to you before they ruin your entire deployment. At 15:05 hours, the illusion shattered. A Russian sonar operator, whose blood pressure was already high enough to shoot out of his ears, noticed something that didn't belong. Tucked underneath the massive, echoing roar of the American carrier and the high-pitched whine of the destroyers, there was a tiny, faint, almost imperceptible mechanical rhythm. It was the whisper-quiet, terrifyingly precise sound of a nuclear reactor coolant pump. The operator furiously adjusted his filters, his eyes widening in absolute horror as the math became clear. There was another submarine in the water. By 17:20 hours, the realization hit the Russian control room like a physical blow. The contact wasn't just another submarine. It was an American Virginia-class fast attack submarine. It had been sitting perfectly in the Russian submarine's acoustic blind spot, trailing them like an underwater ninja holding a sledgehammer. If the Americans were there, it meant the entire stealth approach was a farce. The Russian captain immediately ordered a reduction in speed, bringing the massive vessel to a near halt, switching every single system to ultra-quiet mode. For hours, the control room was dead silent. They just sat in a metal tube hundreds of meters underwater, suddenly realizing they weren't the hunter tracking a carrier. They were a heavily armed zoo exhibit being observed by the zookeepers. The standoff dragged deep into the night, and by 06:31 hours the next morning, the Russian captain decided he'd had enough. By shutting down all non-essential life support and creeping on electric propulsion, the Russian captain faded from the immediate tactical displays and thought he had successfully escaped the perimeter. He thought he had outsmarted the Americans. At 07:02 hours, the US Navy politely informed him otherwise by turning the ocean into a mosh pit. The carrier strike group didn't just go to combat alert, they threw a tactical temper tantrum. You see, when the US Navy momentarily loses track of a hostile submarine, they don't panic. They just use their unlimited budget to ensure the ocean has nowhere left to hide. Destroyers broke formation, powering up massive bow-mounted sonars. Helicopters launched in a synchronized swarm, peppering the water's surface with sonobuoys that dropped directional microphones into the depths. By 07:30 hours, the Russian submarine was sitting in the dark, barely moving, surrounded by a closing net of American steel. The captain was banking everything on the acoustic stealth of his boat. He knew that modern submarines don't need to surface to launch their weapons. They can fire cruise missiles from hundreds of kilometers away. The threat was real, and the US Navy knew it. But the Americans weren't just going to look for the submarine. They were going to systematically dismantle the Russian crew's psychological well-being. At 0900 hours, the sky above the search zone filled with the roar of Boeing P-8 Poseidons. These $130 million submarine hunters began dropping sonobuoys in a massive, inescapable grid. They didn't just listen passively, they went active. Imagine being locked inside a dark, freezing shipping container, and suddenly, someone starts beating on the outside of it with a metal baseball bat. That is what a 140 decibel active sonar ping sounds like inside a submarine hull. It rattles your teeth, it vibrates your organs, it completely destroys the myth of the silent service. At 09:15 hours, the chase escalated from uncomfortable to comedy gold. MH-60R Seahawk helicopters arrived directly over the Russian submarine's estimated position. Hovering 50 feet above the waves, they lowered dipping sonar directly into the water, completely ignoring the Russians' attempts to hide. The Seahawk crews were operating in air-conditioned comfort, sipping coffee, while the Russians below were sweating through their uniforms in a claustrophobic nightmare. At 09:20 hours, the Seahawk sonar pinged the water, once, twice. The return echo was massive. It wasn't a whale. It wasn't a rock formation. The sonar operator in the helicopter didn't even have to guess. The acoustic profile perfectly matched the massive cylindrical hull of the Russian Yasen-class submarine. They had him pinned. The tactical data link instantly shared the exact coordinates with every American ship and aircraft within 100 miles. By 9:32 hours, the Russian crew was in full-blown panic mode. The active pings were hitting their hull with the frequency of a metronome. Being pinged means you are being targeted. The Russian captain realized that stealth was dead, so he opted for speed. He slammed the throttles forward, ordering the submarine to dive and accelerate. But pushing thousands of horsepower through the water destroys whatever acoustic camouflage you have left. The submarine went from being a quiet shadow to sounding like a garbage truck falling down an elevator shaft. They were fleeing, and the Americans were riding their bumper. At 09:50 hours, the U.S. forces tightened the noose. The Seahawks tracked every frantic evasive turn the submarine made. The Russian captain tried everything. He altered his depth, trying to use the ocean's natural thermoclines to bounce the American sonar away. He tried sprinting and drifting, but the U.S. forces matched every move. The ocean had become a 3D battleground, and the Americans had all the cheat codes. At 1:05 hours, the American forces decided it was time to send a message. As the Russian submarine desperately accelerated, blowing its acoustic cover completely, a Seahawk helicopter hovering directly overhead established a weapons-grade targeting lock. To the Russian sonar operators, the sound of a fire control radar locking on is the auditory equivalent of the Grim Reaper clearing his throat. The helicopter pilot authorized the drop of a simulated lightweight Mark 54 anti-submarine torpedo. It didn't matter if it was a training variant or an acoustic warning shot. To the Russians, the splash in the water meant death was approaching at 40 knots. At 10:07 hours, chaos erupted underwater. The Russian sonar room screamed the three worst words in naval warfare: "Torpedo in the water!" The captain ordered violent, desperate, evasive maneuvers. The submarine blew acoustic countermeasures out of its tubes to distract the incoming weapon. The massive vessel groaned under the stress of a high-speed, high-angle dive, the crew clinging to their stations. As the submarine plummeted toward the ocean floor, trying to outrun a machine built specifically to be faster and smarter than they were. By 1011 hours, the Russian submarine executed a textbook thermal layer evasion, plunging deep beneath a dense layer of cold water, hoping the temperature gradient would reflect the torpedo's active sonar. On the American screens, the submarine's signature temporarily blurred, and the dummy weapon lost its lock, circling uselessly. The Russian crew thought they had pulled off a miraculous cinematic escape. They thought their superior tactics had saved them from the brink of destruction. But at 145 hours, as the Russian sub cowered silently in the deep, freezing blackness, the American forces simply sat above them and waited. The U.S. Navy knew exactly where the submarine was. They could see through the thermal layer with their advanced sensors, basically watching a toddler try to win hide-and-seek by standing behind a sheer curtain. The Americans expanded their patrol boxes, kept the helicopters hovering, and let the Russians sit in the dark, terrifying silence of their own making. Finally, at 11:30 hours, the Russian submarine broke. Having endured enough acoustic hammering to last a lifetime, and realizing their intelligence mission was a spectacular failure, the submarine's acoustic signature reappeared on American sonars. But this time, it wasn't sneaking toward the carrier. It was moving away at high speed, fleeing north toward safer waters. The U.S. Navy casually tracked their retreat, escorting them out of the area like a bouncer walking a highly intoxicated patron to the curb. The confrontation was officially over. Down in the cold, crushing depths of the Atlantic, the Russian sailors knew the truth. They had tried to hunt the world's premier superpower in its own backyard, and all they got in return was pure, unadulterated American acoustic humiliation.